And for those of you that can see, we've got the meeting being recorded today as well. So just for when you want to ask questions or speak later, just be aware that the meeting will be being recorded. This came about from two reasons. One, and I think a lot of you will know this, we have a lot of industry experts here, but we also have a lot of practitioners as well. And trying to do synthetic biology or biotechnology ethics has just become incredibly challenging for a number of reasons. One, the geopolitics is getting harder, making data sharing more difficult. Two, the technology's changed so much that governments are trying to keep up. And three, there's just such a volume of applications coming along now that if you're in the government somewhere, you're in a position where you just have so many approvals that you need to go through. It's actually becoming an issue where you're trying to monitor things at a rate that's above what the staffing level currently is. And so that's become a real challenge. The second sort of part to this is where most of us are, including the project team, and the project team who are going to speak today are Sarab Todi, we have Shambhuvi Naik, who's on here as well, and we also have Henry Dixon. They're on the project team, and we're also going to have Dr. Joy Zhang as well, who is from the Centre for Global Science and Epistemic Justice. She's an expert in the field. Someone has just joined. You have a little bit of background noise there. Okay, all good. And so she's going to be giving a scene setter for where we are at the moment in this technology. But what we sort of saw is that voices from what we describe as the Indo-Pacific, which we define from the Pacific Islands through to maybe Pakistan in the west, from Mongolia in the north down to Australia in the south, those voices haven't really been represented in this global discussion as well as we'd like to see, given that it's 50% of humanity. A huge amount of the global biodiversity is within that area. And so we sort of took it upon ourselves to start looking around and asking what our region would want. And we've been inundated with feedback, responses, and welcome open arms. We hosted a workshop at RSIS in Singapore, and some of the people from RSIS are on the line today to hold a workshop around this. And it was incredibly interesting to hear the diversity of views from within our region, but also to hear how much interest there is contributing to this. We've had workshops with people with Chinese groups who are trying to work this out, with Indian groups, Papua New Guinea, the Pacific Islands as well, and within Australia. And so the sense from our point of view is there is just a heck of a lot of desire to contribute to this debate and to make it different. And so what we have done is we've put together a report of what we think a way forward would be, with some frameworks that are 2x2 matrices that other team members are going to talk about today. When you're trying to conceptualize, how do you do Synbio application governance, or how do you do data sharing, or how do you engage the public? We've got frameworks within this report for that, and we've got 2x2 matrices for that. So before I hand over to the speakers today, I just want to say a couple of thanks as well. Obviously, anything in the reports that you don't like, that's the fault and the responsibility of the individual authors. But we'd like to say, obviously, big thank you to Joy Zhang, who's online and who's going to speak today, because she went through and provided detailed feedback on all the drafts. We had a global expert sort of leading that, and that was really, really helpful. I'd like to say a thank you to Daniel Pavlich, who's been the research helper for all of us across the project. And once again, it can be a very thankless task. You do more work than anybody else, but you don't get to share in the plaudits nearly as often. And of course, to all the people who provided feedback from the RSIS workshop, from all the online consultations that we've had. It's been really heartening to hear all the different perspectives and get a sense of what's going on, and also really inspiring. And so I just wanted to say that at the top. I'm now going to hand over to the speakers, and so we have 4 lots of 8 minutes. So first it'll be Joy Zhang, who is the founding director and a professor of founding director of the Centre for Global Science and Epistemic Justice at the University of Kent. She's also written a number of books on life sciences and science justice. The one that we sort of got us connected was The Elephant and the Dragon in Contemporary Life Sciences, which looked at India and China, and how they're trying to, increase their life sciences output. It's a fantastic book, and I'd recommend it to anyone. Then we're going to have Shambhuvi Naik, who's going to talk about the Synbio application governance, that part of the frameworks. Then we're going to have Saurabh Todi, who's going to talk about data sharing, which has been a real thorny subject and one that we're trying to work through. And then finally, we're going to have Henry Dixon, who's at the Western Sydney Institute for Culture and Society within their Centre of Excellence in Synthetic Biology. So we're going to go in that order. I'm going to hand over to you first, Joy, and then we're going to go on. If anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat, but we're going to deal with them after all the speakers have spoken. So Joy, handing over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dirk, and thank you for the generous introduction. And so good morning, good afternoon, and hopefully not so much good evening among the audience. I hope it's all civilized hours for you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's actually a really exciting time to discuss these important issues as Dirk has laid out. So as you know, I have worked in the field of synthetic biology since 2011. And I have to say that it was my real pleasure to be able to be part of the project that's led by Dirk and Shambhavi. And more specifically, I have the kind of sweet privilege of being both an insider and an outsider. I say it's sweet because I feel I got the best of both parts of the deal. I was an insider in the sense that I get to understand the scope and the aim of the project quite early on. And this January started with a Zoom meeting and actually in Shambhavi's office in Bengaluru with Dirk, talking about their vision of how to launch this project as well as associate discussion. And that meeting actually left a very deep impression in me. And I will say a little bit more later about why it aligns with GSEG, that's the Center for Global Science and Epistemic Justice core value. But also, here's where the sweet part comes in. I also have the privilege of being an outsider, of closely observing Dirk and Shambhavi doing all the hard work. So they've done most of the heavy lifting along with their colleagues of all these organizing all these discussions and doing all the field work. And it's really nice to see how this project has developed over the month. And I'm sure the following speakers will give you more intimate personal reflection of how they have revised or changed their view on basis of their discussion with stakeholders. And that process itself further confirms the need for discussion, especially from the Indo-Pacific region. And since my role here is to set the scene, I don't really want to repeat a lot of the technical details or ethical discussions because I assume many of you are very familiar with associated issues. But I do want to highlight two questions that I want you to think about while you listen to the following speakers. The first question I want you to think about is, what are reports for? Especially if you're a social scientist, I really want you to think about this question. We have loads of reports. Every project have report. Every institution have report. And as I said, I was very fortunate to be involved in the synthetic biologist discussion almost right from the start. So beginning 2010, 2011, that's when synthetic biology became a global regulatory issue. That's when the Sixth Academy meeting that's between the UK, US, and China started. And I actually drafted the first working paper that fed into that Sixth Academy discussion on synthetic biology. And even back then, that's 2010, when I was doing research for that very first policy papers, I found that there were already 40 reports on ethics and synthetic biology in the English language alone. And I'm sure as many of you are aware, there are many, many more reports that came out from many parts of the world in the following years. So why do we need all these reports, and what specific can this Indo-Pacific report add to that? I want you to think about this question. And of course, for me, the answer is quite clear, because if you look at these reports, on the one hand, a lot of them are repetitive, especially in the early days. The 40 reports I mentioned, even in the early days, you can quickly see how there's almost a uniform format of how these reports are organized. The structure are very similar. They're talking about very similar things, and the suggestion do not deviate from each other that much. But then when the discussions start to expand, you start to see differences. For example, last year we've seen China, one of China's key national projects have also launched an ethical framework on synthetic biology, is also aimed at a global audience. But that framework is very different from the one that we're talking about. That one is very much focused on values and principles. And to some extent, one could say it actually aligns with China's non-interventionist foreign policy approach. That is just what we should do. But there's not that much practicality in that report. Whereas this one, the one we're discussing, I think that there are two things I want to point out. At least those are the two things that stand out for me. One is a sense of practical urgency for actions. And as I mentioned, I was involved in the very early discussion of this project, and I can assure you that from very early on, I think the team have a very acute sense of making whatever they're doing. At the time, they didn't really know what the outcome would be, but even at the very beginning, the team were very keen to make something useful. And I vividly remember in Shambhavi's office where we're discussing, she was just drawing the a very rudimentary matrix and got really excited. And that was the embryonic stage of that report. And from the very beginning, they've decided to do something along the line of this decision tree, so as to help practitioners make decisions, not so much make decisions for them, but help to structure their decisions so as to make their work slightly easier. I think that intention is something that we all should celebrate. And I hope there will be more projects, more teams around the world that pick up that kind of ethics and action kind of spirit. So that's one thing I found very impressive about this project. Another thing I want to highlight is, as Dirk have briefly mentioned, is how the team have went around the Indo-Pacific region to consult people. And of course, as all of you should know, this is not a massive project. It is only, as I understand, Dirk, you can correct me, but I think it was only 1 year with limited budget and resource. But I think the team has done a wonderful effort in connecting to people. I mean, 89 individuals in 19 countries. Oh my goodness, for a 1-year project, that speaks ambition, dedication, and a lot of perseverance. And for that, I think we should all congratulate the team for achieving this. And this actually comes to my second question. So the first question is, what are reports for? For me, there were two things. But then the second question I want you to think about is, what are we really launching here? Especially we have this grand name called the global launch. And of course, this is the reports I've written for the Indo-Pacific region. It may not be applicable to countries, for example, in the UK where I live, or the US. So why we call it global launch? What are we launching here? The announcement of the existence of this report and the initiative, of course, is part of the reason. But I think we're launching something slightly bigger. And I'm sure the team agree with this. I think the publication of this report is an announcement of a series of public dialogue to come. And in this report, you will see that there's a very acute sense of how we need to bring more voice from non-Western, perhaps non-European voice into the global debate, and how we want to avoid the repeat of, for example, biopiracy or other historical exploitations. And I really want to emphasize the fact that all these aspirations for fairer and more transparent and sustainable communities are really grand, really great. But we also have to remind ourselves and remind our communities that, you know, rights are not something that's been bestowed or granted by a nation or another country or others. Rights are something that needs to be exercised and need to be claimed and need to be adapted and need to be used by every single individual. So if we're serious about having a fair and more sustainable development of synthetic biology, every one of us, every one of the citizens need to have their voice heard and need to have the obligation to understand a little bit of science and understand a little bit of what's going on. And I think that's a sense of responsible citizenship for the new century. And I think this is also what is embedded in the report that we're going to discuss today. And I'm sure that this is only the first step of various public discussions to come. And on that note, finally, I just want to say that this is what aligns very closely to GSED's value. And at the beginning of next year, we will launch a program called Careful Synthesis that's dedicated of promoting public discussions on policy issues around synthetic biology around the world. That includes Latin America, African countries, as well as Indo-Pacific and European and North American countries. And well, actually, Indo-Pacific region is not the area that we're specialized in. So we'll very much look forward to further collaboration with Dirk and Synbio on carrying the conversation further. That's all from me. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Joy, for that. That's fantastic. So now that we've got the scene set and the big picture questions, and I don't know if you saw, Joy, but in the chat there's a question for you to lay them out for dot points, because there's people that want to remember that. But I'm going to hand over to Synbio now. I'll share the screen so you can have the matrices up, but she's going to talk about how we've conceptualized governance for Synbio applications. So over to you, Synbio.
Thank you, Dirk. Thank you, Joy, for setting that stage so nicely. Hi, everyone. I'm Synbio, and I'm going to talk to you about the first framework. But basically, how did we come across this ideas of frameworks, right? As has been laid out before, we spoke to a number of people, number of practitioners, policymakers, policy analysts, etc., over the past year. And we tried to find out what were the recurring questions that we came across again and again. The first big one is obviously, what is synthetic biology? Nobody's able to pin that down. There is no universally agreed definition. It keeps on changing so rapidly. There are new technologies coming in every day. So policymakers who might not actually be very familiar with the technology itself be able to govern it. That was the first question. And the second question that we saw again, and the second comment actually, I think that we saw again and again, was that there might not be enough state capacity to be able to assess applications of synthetic biology that are coming in appropriately, to risk assessments, to benefit assessments, and take a really nice view of how to approach governance, right? When there is no state capacity, what often happens is that we bin all of the applications into one sort of category. So either all synthetic biology is great and it's going to be a silver bullet for disease, for agriculture, for climate change, or all synthetic biology is going to be bad and we're going to get bioweapons. And that is not true, right? That is not true. There's a range of applications within synthetic biology where the risks might outweigh benefits, but there are also applications where the benefits are going to outweigh risks. And what we want is that countries be able to, in their own context, be able to apply correct governance, be able to promote those applications of synthetic biology where the benefits outweigh risks. Again, benefits outweighing risk might change from country to country. And as Dirk has mentioned before, we did not want to provide prescription on what's to be done, but rather provide a way to think about this. I think Tom, in one of our earlier discussions, one of our earlier roundtables, had called these frameworks prompts for thinking. I quite agree with that idea, and I'm going to continue to plagiarize him. These are prompts for thinking. How do you go about thinking of synthetic biology governance when we cannot define synthetic biology and where we might not have enough capacity to understand? The framework that I'm going to discuss right now does not apply to humans, simply because when it comes to gene therapies for humans, for example, there is a lot of global conversation that is happening. We are cautious simply because it is for humans. There is a lot more global scrutiny that is given to the way the applications are developed, their safety standards, they're tested more rigorously, and their progress is going to be gradual. But what we expect in the next few years is obviously a lot of other applications of synthetic biology, maybe in agriculture, using microbes for climate change, for bioenergy, which are going to flood our governance systems with approval requests. How do you assess that? How do you equip and simplify governance for policymakers? That was the question that this framework is trying to answer. So when we think about when we had these conversations with a lot of the policymakers and scientists, and also a lot of literature survey that we did on how publics perceive synthetic biology, what are the main ethical concerns, there were two kind of observations that people tried, that we saw again and again. This idea that we're going to create something novel, something completely different from what is naturally found, and that is abhorrent, right? How can we allow something like this to happen? What will happen once, is a synthetic organism similarly treated as a natural organism? So there was this issue with divergence, right? People were okay if we use traditional methods of plant breeding, for example, but genetically modified organism suddenly seems to be giving human beings a lot of power. So there's a lot of ethical concerns that come with the ability to create organisms which are just completely different from naturally occurring organisms. So that is one axis, the divergence of the organism that you're looking at. The other is, can we control this organism? What happens if it goes into nature and creates something completely different, right? Because it's interacting, it is evolving, it is not an inert organism in that sense. What if it evolves and impacts environment in a way that we cannot then rectify? And so this framework basically puts those two problems on an axis. Now, having said that, the 2x2 framework looks at factors which we think are going to be of most use in trying to guide policy action. By no means are they the only factors that can guide policy action. There might be others as well. It is just that we think that these are probably going to be the priority factors. They're usually mutually exclusive factors as well, and sometimes can take over. There are other aspects of synthetic biology which might get involved as part of the axis. The other thing we were quite clear of when we started making this matrix is that every country in the Indo-Pacific has its own set of ethics that has developed from its history, from its culture, from its people, and we do not want to impose our own ethical groundings on them. So before you apply this matrix to any sort of application in synthetic biology, we expect the government of that country to have made a call on whether it is ethically appropriate for that community to be able to adopt an application, right? So ethics at the level of the population is to be answered for by the government. Once it has chosen to kind of adopt any application, then this framework would be applicable. So the framework basically then categorizes applications based on how divergent they are from its naturally occurring counterpart, if one exists, and how reproducible the organism is. Now, the second question that we came across when we created this matrix is, how do you define divergence? In many cases, divergence is looked at from a genotypic point of view. So how different is the nucleic acid, DNA or RNA from the naturally occurring organism? But what we have also seen then with a lot of stakeholder conversations is that you can make a number of changes in the genotype with very little change in the actual physical characteristics of the organism. Vice versa, you can make a couple of changes in the genotype, but that might actually cause a disease form to occur. So should we look at genotypic divergence, or should we look at phenotypic divergence once it comes to actually categorizing these applications? We have chosen phenotypic divergence because we think that that is where, I mean, the hardware of biology is where all the interactions, where possible impact on environment, on human health, etc., are going to play out. Also, if you use traditional means for, say, plant breeding, there are a number of genotypic changes that happen any which ways, right? But we account for mostly physical changes, physical characteristics. So it is the receptor change that can help a pathogen bind to a cell. It is a change in the enzyme that can make it more powerful or rectify a disease. So we have chosen phenotypic divergence, and we are happy to get feedback on whether genotypic might make more sense. But phenotypic divergence versus whether that organism will reproduce in the environment. Now, based on that, we suggest 4 policy actions. So if the particular organism that you're looking at has low reproducibility, low divergence, which basically means it's not really going to harm the environment unless it dramatically evolves after some time, which is unlikely because it is not reproducible in a natural environment. Then we recommend that the government set safety standards on how these can be used, and then not really regulate it harshly. If, however, it is low reproducibility, but high on divergence, so it's a completely novel sort of an organism, it is not going to grow, but you're trying to, say, bring in a new form of bacteria that can help generate energy. Then you need to be able to basically figure out whether that is required, if what kind of safety regulations might be needed for that, how can it be used effectively, and hence for that particular type, we say that you should be able to set up expert working groups that can come up with a dedicated set of guidelines applicable for those. If the organism is highly reproducible, which is where it is likely going to have a lot of environmental impacts if it is allowed to grow in a natural environment, but it is very similar to organisms that are naturally occurring anyways, might have eventually, a naturally occurring organisms might naturally evolve into this particular synthetic biology kind of a variant eventually anyways, then we do not need to actually regulate it harshly, but we should monitor because that's still an introduction that has been made by human society. So monitor the way it evolves, see if it is changing into something that is dramatically different, and if it could have some unintended consequences. So for that, we said monitor. And then if it is a highly reproducible organisms, and it's a high degree of divergence, this is where a synthetic biology ethics is probably going to be tested the most, because not going to have a natural variant to compare it to. It can dramatically impact the environment if it is let out loose. In that case, we should try to contain. So this could be containment within facilities, within labs. If it is used to create a product, for example, that by itself is not reproducible, then this can be set up in containment labs, right? So for those kind of proposals, if the government thinks that they are really necessary and going to be a game changer for the societies, then we recommended that those be kept in contained conditions. So this was a basic way for us to try and identify what kind of policy actions governments can take based on the various kinds of synthetic biology applications that come their way. Again, the whole idea of state capacity, of what can be looked at divergence, what can be counted as reproducibility, is left to individual governments, because we don't want to be prescriptive. This is just an anchor for how governments can think about it. I'll stop there. I'll hand it over to Saurabh to take us through the next framework. Thank you, Dirk.
Hi everyone, I am Saurabh Todi, and thanks to Joy and Dirk for setting the stage. So in this framework, I think the broad idea here is that given the developments and advancements in gene sequencing technologies and CRISPR and gene synthesis, the amount of data that is being collected for both human and non-human organisms is immense. And with the advent of AI, machine learning, LLMs, the capacity to analyze data has also increased. That has led to this kind of explosion of of data. So you see countries also opting to, sequence the genomes of their population, the different ethnic groups, and like a more representative sample of their population and flora and fauna. So this is now leading to kind of a new situation where there is huge amounts of data that is being collected and is available, but the sharing is something that is like problematic, in the sense that there are concerns regarding undue economic benefit that the companies or countries that can exploit the flora and fauna of developing countries as compared to their own sources. On the other hand, the issue is regarding the biosafety and biosecurity of human data, and how, given the dual use nature of some specific applications of synthetic biology, is it okay to share data of your population? So these are the two broad kind of questions that we were trying to address when thinking about, how to facilitate cross-border genetic data sharing. So why do we need to share data? I mean, in a very broad sense, the idea is that it is something that is important both for the scientific community and for the humankind as a whole, because more sharing of data should ideally lead to much better development of applications, and also the fact that more sharing of data makes data sets more representative, which allows for greater representation of the human population in those data sets and then their applications. So to kind of come up and develop these frameworks, there are three broad principles that we kept in mind. First one, which I talked briefly, was to think of genetic data as a global public good. So I mean, it is not the kind of public good what we see in terms of economics. I mean, that is not the case. But the idea that if there is more sharing of data, that would lead to global good in terms of better and more representative research applications and more and well-informed academic research. Second idea is of informed consent. Whenever the data is collected from human or non-human sources, depending on the regulations of the country in question, the informed consent should be something that is very, very important. For humans, the idea is that the person should need control of their data, and for non-human sources, the country or the regulatory authority that is responsible for that flora and fauna should know where their data is being used and for what purpose. So just to reiterate, the idea here is that the concept of informed consent can be understood differently by different countries, and it may also depend on the type of the application, what the purpose is, and what the data source is. So we leave it to the country to countries to define, like what standards of informed consent they may want to use for what purpose. But these are the, again, broad talking points and implementation strategies that the countries may use. And the third aspect is to respect anonymity. This is mainly for human data. There are concerns regarding data being misused when it comes to human data, or the data that is even anonymized, that is able to be de-identified. That is something that can create a lot of problems for individuals involved, their close genetic relatives, and the country broadly, given the biosafety and biosecurity concerns. So this is something also that we should keep in mind. So what are the broad factors, that influence a country's decision whether or not you should share data? So the first one is source organism, from where would you get the data? Then what is the purpose of the data? Is it being used for academia, for industry, for defense? So those concerns. Then is the regulatory infrastructure in the recipient country or institution, is it strong enough to kind of adhere and ensure that the receiver adheres to those three broad principles that I just talked about? And then the idea is of benefit sharing, is that the countries would like to have a share of the economic benefit that comes out from the data that they are sharing. So countries may want to also ensure that those agreements are in place. So the two frameworks have these three policy factors. First is the global impact, which is common for both non-human and human framework. So we have two frameworks, one for human data and one for non-human data. So global impact here means that what are the perceived potential benefit that the global community might accrue from the sharing of this data. Again, this is also subjective, depending on the country and their ethics and their regulatory environment. The country may decide what do they mean by global impact and what follows through in that and not. So that is that. And then then for non-human data, the main factor here is degree of endemism. How endemic is the source organism is to the country that has the data. So, and we think that this is a reasonable kind of axis, is because if the organism is highly endemic, then the potential of the country accruing economic benefit from its use is higher as compared to if the organism is not very endemic, which means that the organism can be sourced from different countries. So these are the two axes, and there are three different types of access to data. So first one is open access, which means that there is no restrictions on the data. The data is put up. So we kind of imagine its implementation as the country or a group of countries can have a common like a data sharing biobank where they can upload all this data. So the open access is where there are no restrictions. These are just available. The person can just log in and access the data. The second one is the restricted access, which is there to show that the data access is highly kind of like restricted, in the sense that you need to get express permission from the regulatory agency to access that data. So this would be of in situations where it does have a high global impact, for example. So there is a potential for high economic value, and there is also a high degree of endemism, which means that when you share the data, the country in question may be able to have a much more favorable data sharing framework. And then you have the controlled access, where controlled access means that the data is on the platform, but the regulatory agency may want to ensure that they know who is accessing the data and for what purpose. So that one more step of ensuring that they have an idea of who is using this and for what purpose. And the next for human data, Dirk, the slides.
Oh, yep.
Yeah. So for human data, the second axis here is the risk of the anonymization, because the one major factor that concerns countries and also plays a role in securitization of genetic data is how easily can the source, which means individuals or population groups, can be identified. So if the data type is something that has a low risk of de-anonymization and obviously has a high global impact, for example, the access would be controlled where there would not be much of a risk in terms of privacy of individuals. So you would opt for that. And you would have, let's say, open access if the data has low global impact and a lower risk of de-anonymization. You would have restricted access, let's say, for data that has high risk of de-anonymization and a high global impact. So like just to give a few examples, for example, you would have a restricted access, if you are sharing, for example, the whole genome sequences of, individuals that due to, third-party data sets if you can track back the individual in question, that might be something that you want to be very careful of, or if this is a community that is endemic to a country or to region, then the country may choose to restrict access. And then you would have the same controlled access for high risk, but for low global impact. So these are the kind of broad two frameworks that we have for human data and non-human genetic data sharing. Thanks, and over to Henry.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, thanks very much for having me. This last framework is about public and stakeholder engagement. Right off the bat, I'll just plant the seed here that the framework that you're looking at here, it's got two axes like the other ones you've seen. The x-axis is basically, is it safe? That's what that means. And the y-axis is, can I say no? So these are the sort of two main public concerns that people express. Is it safe? And yes, that opens up a whole other discussion of what do we mean by safe? And then, can I say no? Is also very, very specific to different conditions and different communities and all these kinds of concerns. But that's what it comes down to. So what is engagement? We'll just jump into that straight away. So basically involves listening to people. Sharing, it also involves sharing information transparently, working to find solutions that reflect diverse perspectives. But the actual methods that could be involved, as a lot of people here know, could be very diverse. It could be community discussions, citizen panels, educational events, and so on. But the whole point that we're emphasizing in this framework is just to underscore two-way interactions that build trust and help shape decisions with public input. So how we do this is we try and tailor the engagement. So we're not presenting a silver bullet method, because we think that this, different groups, different segments of different publics will have different perspectives and different issues and preferences and values. So you can sort of think of it as like a landscape with different biomes, really. You don't really have one sort of size fits all. And we're very much emphasizing in these sort of list of different rules, different principles in this section, things that ultimately lead into building trust, rather than thinking that you can just sort of gain it like you've leveled up in a video game or something. It's something that you build with time through honest communication. And a really important part of that is understanding public perspectives. That's what I do professionally. I try to. And the whole point of it is understanding really what people think, what they say, what they mean when they say certain things. And when it comes to synthetic biology, in a nutshell, people basically think it's exciting, it's cool, but it also sounds like some things could go wrong. And and maybe I don't like the sound of it actually. So you do have these quite mixed discussions that go on, and it opens up the floor for a lot of vibrant discussions about nature, our relationship to nature, technology in the future, rather than maybe specific details of the tools in question. A really important aspect to bring up right now about Synbio in this regard is that it's a sort of post-normal science. So it's highly complex, and that complexity meets very high stakes. So you've got very complex ecosystems as well. You've got the climate, populations, and complex societies, and this sort of comes into play, and you have very important decisions to make. So what you're dealing with here is you're dealing with compound complexity. So think about it. And if complexity compounds, it's very hard to deal with it with a sort of single, or let's say boiling it down to a set of kind of tangible arguments. People tend to lean into what in psych they call domain general cognitive heuristics, which is to say a general rule, a rule of thumb, a cautionary way of thinking, and saying things like, it sounds like it's messing with nature, it's not for me. So the reason why I've just given that spiel is there is a certain amount of a kind of, it's this kind of a heritage of pushback against Synbio that comes from also GMO, bioengineering, nanotech, even nuclear and other emerging technologies when they were. That is sort of a kind of counter narrative to it. And I regard these things as actually quite useful, and they tell us a lot rather than dismissing them. They can be used for positive purposes, but there is that slight problem of there is this sort of general pushback against the field overall that can happen in the tone, it can happen in comms, or it can manifest in different ways, and it can have very serious impacts. You can have things like the controversy, the GMO controversy in the UK in the early 2000s and so on. So what we advocate in this framework is leaning more into, okay, we've got diverse opinions, but we also have diverse applications, and they are for diverse issues. So public opinions, we do know, but it's sort of emerging. Public opinions vary based on application, industrial uses, consumables, environmental uses. It's not really the case that someone might agree with one and therefore agree with the other, or disagree with one and therefore disagree with the other. So we sort of advocate overall an approach where you engage publics on the sort of, to do this properly, you need to move beyond maybe a broader conversation of Synbio overall of the field, and maybe dive into discussions about specific tools with specific capabilities, risks and benefits. CRISPR to be used for conservation purposes, or something, a tool-based approach or feature-based approach. And obviously to do this alongside an issues-based approach. So you can lead with conservation and talk about that and the various approaches you can do, including Synbio solutions. And this is just a sort of philosophical approach that's gone into this. It's not been said explicitly throughout it, but it's something that we as a team have talked about and planted the seeds in certain places. And when it comes to public discussions and public engagement around Synbio, you do find that there's a lot of interesting and important stuff that comes out of it beyond just acceptance or non-acceptance of what's the purpose of it, who benefits, what are the intended consequences, the unintended consequences, and trying to build that into policy is the big challenge, I think. And the energy that we've got here is to say, look, we don't have the magic bullet solution for how you can take a controversial view and put it into policy, but we do have this framework to say it's a big net, it's going to catch some big fish, it's going to miss some others, but a lot of these views that are of all sorts of different kinds, economic, social, health, moral and so forth, will fall in some way on this matrix. And as a result of this, we can probably cluster them together in certain ways, contrast them in other ways. You try and, through public engagement, understand where people fall on a particular tool, on a particular application, and decide whether it's regarded as low agency, so I don't have very much control over whether it happens or not, or high versus low safety or high. And we also do this with experts. It's not just lay, as they say, public views, but also, and when I say experts, I mean synthetic biology experts in the field. I am not excluding other people who are experts in other areas. And there would be experts, of course, in other areas that we would be wanting to include, depending on the issues that it's about. And what we've done is we've developed 4 different quadrants here. They're probably they're debatable. We've had a lot of interesting discussions and debates with all sorts of academics from different fields and policy experts and so forth, and thought leaders. And what we have for the moment is these 4 different quadrants, being one of them is targeted engagement, light engagement, protective engagement, which is the worst of both worlds, when you have something that is both dangerous and you can't get away from it, and then an inclusive engagement, which is low agency but relatively safe. So something like pseudo-organisms for bioremediation, maybe not dangerous, but people can't say no once it's implemented. We can debate whether these make sense or should be tweaked or what have you. And we've done this, and there's all sorts of different ways you could mix and match these. But my main point here is to remember the 2 core dimensions, which is safety on the one dimension and agency on the other. And without sort of, wading too far into this, because perhaps we could do this in a discussion, the core thing to take away is that there is really no one size fits all. But we did feel that boiling this down to 2 core principles, all these different kinds of concerns, and applying them to guide engagement goals broadly was really the best way that we could offer some degree of utility to what is in fact a very difficult issue. It is really tough to take these diverse views and boil them down to something that can be useful, and you do lose a certain degree of detail in that, but you broaden your ability to look at a larger population or set of tools. So that's it. I'll stop with that, and thanks very much for having me.
Perfect. Thank you, Henry. So I think we're just going to jump straight into the questions. We have a whole bunch already coming in, so I'm going to apportion them appropriately, if that's okay with everyone. But I am going to take the moderator's prerogative just to say a couple of things. One of the things that I think came through in a lot of this, but I just want to emphasize, is the issue of prioritization, because whenever we've come up with a matrix, everyone says, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? And that's really useful, and it is, a lot of that detail is in the report, but eventually at some point, if you're talking at a level of governance, you do need to identify the things that are most important, particularly when you're dealing with a capacity constrained government or a capacity constrained stakeholder. And so that's the sort of reason we've chosen the 3 areas where we think they're the ones that matter the most. They're not the only ones. And then trying to work out axes that would get to, the most consequential pieces within that. It's not to say they're the only things. That's all I'm going to say, but I'm going to actually open it up to a question. So first of all, I'm going to give each of the speakers one of the questions from the chat, if that's okay. So the first one, I wanted to sort of distribute, if that's okay, if I can find the question just now. Whoop, sorry. Okay, there's a question from Manjalika Vaz in here. And so this one I'm going to ask Saurabh to potentially answer is, would it be up to individual governments to allow or disallow commercial transactions for these data? Are there international norms, laws, guidelines regarding this in terms of rights and trades conventions? So that one's for you, Saurabh. There's one here, I think from Siddhant, and this is for you, Shambhavi, and it's, how are the 2 axes calibrated? What are the factors that we look at while calibrating axes for decision making? And Henry, there's a nice one down here for you. Is context, public engagement matrix? What kind of safety, environmental or human health, biodiversity, of course, they're all interrelated. Does high perceived agency include cultural beliefs of the society? So I'm going to, like, that's a good question. I'm going to add one little bit for you, Henry, is could you give examples of when we've seen this? Like, I know you've done research in a number of places around Australia. Could you maybe give a concrete example of how this has worked in practice when you're sort of thought about your research? So that'll be the three first questions. There's more questions coming, but I'll let each one of you deal first. We might go in the order of Shambhuvi, Saurabh, Henry, and then we'll get to the next round of questions.
Thank you, Dirk. Thanks for the question, Siddhant. So there's actually a lot of research that has been done into how do you create these matrices. And I'll be happy to share papers on this. The way we went around doing this was first to identify the questions we wanted to address. For example, in the first matrix, it was how do you categorize synthetic biology applications for governance issues, right? Based on how they might be ethically perceived. What are the biggest problems that people see when it comes to accepting or adopting synthetic biology applications? You then jot down the factors that might decide policy actions. For us, it was what is the biggest risk of deploying any synthetic biology application. That was going to be environmental impact. Again, because we're not looking at humans, right, in that first framework. So for us, it was maybe going to be environmental impact. And what was the one factor that people might be most worried about is how novel is that? How different is that particular organism from a naturally occurring variant? But you can consider a lot of other factors. The way you actually create that 2x2 is you would want to pick mutually exclusive factors so that there is no overlap. That if there's overlap, then you really can't get very clear quadrants. So mutual exclusivity of the factors is extremely important. The 2x2, by the way, is a well-known public policy tool, but once you start using it, you will start using it in everyday life as well. It just fits, the thinking approach kind of fits into your brain. The other strength of the 2x2 is obviously you then, once you have decided on the axis, you can leave the calibration to the country or to the eventual stakeholder who will use the 2x2. What we have seen in a lot of these multilateral talks, so what we have seen when we have multiple stakeholders, is that every person will think about that calibration differently. So safety, for example, on the framework that you can see, people in India will think about perceived safety very differently from people in Australia, from somebody in Singapore, from somebody in Malaysia, right? And you want them to be able to do that. That was the whole point of using the 2x2, is did not want to be prescriptive in that, this is the application, this is where we think it will, this is the kind of policy action we think you should be taking, right? So the calibration, we leave it to the eventual stakeholder who kind of is going to use the framework. This can be based on then their own state capacity, their own cultural and ethical roots, and in how they might perceive a particular application, their environmental challenges. This is a conversation I had once had at one of the BRICS forum meetings. This was when Brazil was very actively using genetically modified mosquitoes for alleviation of malaria. And there was a lot of debate going on whether they should be used or not. And we were told that, look, the problem is so bad for us that we need to use this technology. We understand that there are concerns with using it, but the net benefits outweigh the risks for us, right? So we don't want to make those decisions for others. So the calibration is basically left to the stakeholder. Does that answer your question, Siddhant?
Yes, Shambhi, but so my point of the question was, so when I was thinking about the phenotypic divergence versus the genotypic divergence. So in that, I think there can be some scientific basis for calibration, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So genotypic divergence, for example, is used very commonly in genetically edited plants, the governance of genetically edited plants. For example, even in India, we allow certain up to a certain number of gene edits to not have stringent regulations. So they can be passed through institutional ethics committees and be passed through. If you do a lot of changes, then they would probably have to be sent through the same regulatory pathway as genetically modified organisms.
Yep, got it. Thank you, Shambhi.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Saurabh next.
Yes, thanks, Dirk. So yeah, to Manjulika's question, yeah, I think the idea here is, which follows through what Shambhavi also mentioned, is that anyway, even right now, the regulations, I mean, do exist, both domestic and international. So there is the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol that kind of regulates the sharing of genetic data, and there are some expectations that there will be access and benefit sharing. There is also the new WIPO treaty on genetic resources, which puts in additional requirements on the countries, on the signatories, to ensure that they disclose the origin of this data if they're using their traditional knowledge. At the same time, there are norms regarding, when you have patient data, when you collect data for a project, there are restrictions on who can you share it with and how can you share it with, and all of that. I think what we're trying to do here is that different countries may have different benchmarks of what is allowed and what is not allowed. Country A, for example, the UK Biobank is a good example, where they are much more forthcoming in sharing data as compared to many other countries. So if the UK, for example, the UK regulator and the government feels that they are okay with sharing this data, and then they may want to forego, let's say, some commercial benefit if it does contribute majorly to global good, then that's their choice. So that is the kind of idea here, is that the access, at least for the gene data sharing framework, is that one is the perceived benefit, and the perception may change depending on the country, and second is those two factors for human and non-human. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to hand over to Henry now, but also there's a related question, Henry, that you might want to consider as well from Julius. So the question that's already been asked, you stick with that, but while we're dealing with that, there was a question from Julius about public engagement. Would it be useful to consider public opinion measurements? Yes, and this is something that we're hoping to put out money for. So if there's any funders on the line, we'd love to do that, and we'd one, for collating what's already been done, but then working out where the gaps are. So I think, Julius, the question on public engagement and polls is really helpful.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to go back to you, Henry, to deal with the original question that you had to deal with.
And just as an adjunct to what Dirk said, yeah, I left out, just for the sake of time, quoting a bunch of things, because I did have a bunch of things. I have things from OGTR and all sorts of interesting stats and things and measures of things. And it's important, but I just wanted to keep it a bit briefer. So yeah, we're very much on the same page there. The question, I think, was, does high agency include cultural beliefs in society? And these two, yes, these two dimensions, we debated back and forth as a team. Originally, it was agency versus safety. But there's this issue of perception and experience, and there's a degree of subjectivity there, but also a degree of a specificity for different communities as well. For better or worse, the language might change ultimately, but we went with perceived agency and perceived safety. But ultimately, both of these collapse various things: perception, historical contingencies, socioeconomic factors, structural factors and beliefs. So for instance, you could be a particular interest group saying, no, this has low safety, right? But this might be coming from a place of moral or cultural values that is particular to your group. This may be to do with something like genome editing, for instance. So very much so. But specifically in terms of agency, I was trying to think of an example, and I am not well schooled in the gentleman's cultural background, but we had one man from South Australia of Aboriginal descent who had a lot of interesting points to make about the use of resources and how using, for instance, water in a particular way actually, we may even have someone in the audience today who's looked at this stuff a lot. It constitutes something that is a moral quandary for him more than it would be for someone else who doesn't have that set of cultural values. Would look at water, for instance, as the less problematic, let's say, in the process of developing a new biological part, for instance. I'll give you my last thing, very quick example from Vanuatu. I during my PhD and did some postdocs in Melanesia in Vanuatu. And over there, their traditional way of growing food is on family land. They've done it for generations. They do it without pesticides. They do it without genetically modified food and so on. And you could argue that, well, this is a highly safe thing, and it's worth a go doing it. But you're ignoring the fact of the sort of structural aspect there, and how you can obviously, through conditionalities and so on, you can manipulate people to take on something that will ultimately change the way they live, how they eat, how they produce food, which affects everything to do with life over there. And this is a lack of sort of cultural calibration when it comes to agency. Long story short is we do need to be very culturally sensitive about context when we talk about either of these things. And that's my response.
Thanks, Henry. So there's a couple of other questions. One I can deal with, one I'll half deal with. So there was a question about proportionality versus the precautionary principle. And in the deep, dark text somewhere in the introduction, we said we are not obliged to take one principle over another, that we're going to pick and choose what works for what case. And if you look at the data sharing section that's Saurabh talked about today, where we're really in a case of where it is relatively proportional. In the case where, you know, the data is seen to not be hugely globally, or when it's seen to be not at high risk of de-anonymisation, or it's has relatively low levels of endemism. I'm just going to get it down to the exact one here. So I've got the low degree of endemism for non-humans. The access becomes higher because we're sort of thinking about a case where there's a high global impact, and the impact is presumed to be good. It's not a case of, you know, you're sharing viral DNA sequences here. And so we're sort of in a situation here where we're looking at a proportional approach mostly, where, you know, if there's more benefit, then we do consider a slightly more open access than when you have the same level of endemism, but like low global impact. Obviously got open access here as well, but the relative like controlled versus restrict is different. So we have a proportional versus it's more of a proportional approach, not completely. And then when you deal with Shambhuvis, it's once again not a completely precautionary approach at all. We're looking at cases where you can change things. But it's not a case of like it's 100% only precautionary, but it's closer to where precautionary is, because obviously you have low reproducibility of an organism. You tend to have lower controls than you otherwise would when you have a higher reproducibility of the organism. And so there is an element there that is definitely precautionary, but it's not a pure precautionary approach or a pure proportional approach. There's too many P's in the various approaches in Synbio. But we sort of like, you know, where we think one's appropriate, we choose one. Where the other one is appropriate, we choose another one. Now, we got to get to this tough question by Peter, and you can immediately see why for the data one has been probably the most challenging of all the frameworks. All of them had their own difficulties, but and I'm just going to read it out. When security is invoked in the framework, is this in relation to securing information per se, or security in the sense of dual use, maleficent use of information and security of people? So when we're talking about safety in the very third one, down here, if I can get down far enough, that is the perception of individuals themselves. So we're talking about safety, you know, do they perceive, you know, synthetic milk, just to take an example, as safe or not? And that is the perception of the society itself. It's not what the scientists necessarily say, it's how the community itself sees that, or if we're talking about crops on the next land and you are a farmer, is this going to impact you in some way? Not because you like you're eating it, but because there's risk of overflow into where you are. And so in that sort of sense, we're talking about safety. But when we come to the data sense, where like obviously there's a security component that we have to mention, not on the frameworks, but up above, that people are extremely concerned about de-anonymization of data. And that's definitely a security issue that we're thinking of, as well as a personal comfort issue. And so in that sense, we are thinking about maleficent use if you were going to talk about, you know, access to things. And I think also in the degree of endemism as well, if you have something that has a high degree of endemism, a low degree of endemism, let me rephrase that, a low degree of endemism, then if that thing is shared, you do tend to stand the possibility of losing access to the economic benefits, or if it has some sort of thing that can be damaging, there is that component there as well. So we are thinking, like, in different circumstances, security is a really, really big part of this. And I wanted to add one thing. I was kind of like going to get Saurabh to answer the question, but I got started and I couldn't help myself. One of the things we really that's going to be a real challenge for this, and you know, there are huge global impacts from sharing data, massive positive global impacts, but individual countries are extremely sensitive now, and that's overriding what is going on. And so we're trying to think of a way that, you know, we can still get some of the benefits of sharing data without having to actually, you know, cut everything off, which is the route that we're going in certain cases. I mean, doing things with like Vietnam or China now, it's not impossible, it's very, very, very difficult to do that. All right, I've had a bit of a go at it. Did you, either of Shambhuvi or Saurabh, want to add anything on that? Because I kind of waffled on a bit, and I kind of want to read the other questions while we do that. So did either of you have anything you wanted to say on that particular front?
Saurabh, I think you should take this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Over to you, Saurabh. I know you always get the tough ones because the data one is really, really hard.
No, I mean, you did cover it nicely. So yeah, I mean, I would just say that, I mean, even security is very contextual. So for example, it is true that, I mean, for, let's say, the example regarding, you know, BAWC or Australia group, if you're talking about sequences of a smallpox, it's very clear, like smallpox is not really dual use, as in, I mean, you would not want to research on it unless it is for a specific purpose. So those restrictions are applicable, and they're more clearly delineated. But given that, again, Synbio is a extremely broad field and there are dual use concerns, so we also don't even know what data might be used, which data might be used for what purpose. So countries, given this kind of lack of complete information and new technologies coming in, and we are not even sure, you know, what can be used for what. So countries, the default kind of approach now is to securitize everything. That, oh, I will not want to share my data because I don't know. So I mean, one example which I often wonder was, almost all countries are now sequencing their populations, at least making a representative sample of their population. But very few countries are okay sharing that. Why is that the case? To be honest, I don't know much of the answer on this as well. But the idea is that there is a certain level of security concern that is there on the back of their minds, but they're not sure, you know, what it is and is it okay to share it now. So I think what we try to do is that, let's say you may not want to share a whole genome sequence of a population, which is maybe like kind of understandable. But if certain aspects of that sequence is like certain sequences, certain kind of small segments of that sequence can be shared for something that is global good and does not have a lot of security concerns, then that is okay. So that is the kind of approach we are going for.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Tom's asked a very difficult question, a very good one. We're going to pass it over to our resident, specialist, or not specialist, but expert when we come to these tough, like technical questions. So I'm going to give it to Shambhuvi. Then the question is like, what goes to things that might be between the human and the non-human, such as the HeLa cells that have decades of genetic drift and cannot really be described as human. So if I've given you a hospital pass there, I'm really sorry, Shambhuvi, but that one I'm going to put in your court.
Thank you. I have no idea what I'm a specialist in at this point of time to answer that question. However, as someone who has used HeLa cells extensively in my past life as an academician, I mean, it is a very difficult question to answer because we have a lot of legacy of being inequitable, being exclusive, not being inclusive enough when it comes to a number of these cell lines that we have used for decades now, right? On which a number of HeLa, for example, a number of our current cancer treatments that stand on. And obviously, you're right, Tom. It has changed. It looks so similar now in all. I mean, it looks very similar in like all institutions in India, but very different from the one I used to use in the UK. So we don't really know whether the HeLa that we currently have is actually anything to do with the HeLa that we got from Henrietta Lacks many decades ago. That's a very difficult one to answer, and I don't think we actually thought about this deeply enough. Most likely because we wanted these frameworks to first address the bigger questions that policymakers had. We did not have a look. We did not probably have the time and scope to look at some of these niche questions that I hope in subsequent time we do take a look at. So these current frameworks per se, I don't think will be applicable to things like HeLa and other cell lines. But I think these might be a really good mirror for us to try and understand how subsequent synthetic biology organisms, which look nothing like our natural variants, will be assessed. How do we think about it? How will the convention of biological diversity think about it? Once they actually become such a routine part of diversity, do we start then including them as part of our natural biodiversity after many generations, after they have evolved? I think there's some really interesting questions that are hidden there. I'm sorry we have not had the time to think about them extensively. And the answer to your question right now is I don't know.
Thank you, that's very honest. And I guess that's why we do these things, because we find little gaps that we haven't thought of, and it's probably worthwhile for subsequent. We have a really important, I think it's a comment from Professor Amin. Endemism and global impact could change with time, depends on the expansion speed of the organism. So this is not a static thing, or however you choose to monitor this, even if you don't use our particular framework, that it needs to be something that we do. It does change over time. And one of the things he said down the bottom, which I personally agree with, so now personal opinion, not a team opinion, the risk ratio is acceptable. And that's one of the points I think we want to get at here with him, what we're doing. A lot of the times, we haven't seen the risk ratio in the way that he's using that word. Now I'm using it in the way often it's seen only through a risk lens, not through a risk benefit lens. And so that is, I think, a really important component that we need to try and continue to remind ourselves, whilst also trying to worry about the security side of things. So we've got a couple more messages down the bottom. I'm trying to, good. Okay. Follow-up question from Joyce for Young, and this will probably be the last question, because it'll take, by the time I read it and get it done, we'll be just about at the end of time. Who are the intended users of this document? As it indicates in the conclude, it seems to be aimed at policymakers in developing governance. Matrix is indeed very insightful and useful, but what about coordination, collaboration between countries if overarching is to promote the public good? All right, I'm going to have, I'll have a go at that one, because that's a really good one. So at the moment, we're thinking about this, if you are a stakeholder in this, whether you're a policymaker, even if you're in the point of science and how are you going to conceptualize this, but policymakers are probably the first group of people, but the other stakeholders that need to consider this when they're dealing with something that isn't strictly codified in law, which is pretty common in this particular technology, So we're sort of thinking about it at that. We haven't abstracted up to collaboration between countries for the simple reason that our impression from the discussions that we had across the region was that most countries hadn't got their own house in order yet, so it became very difficult to do the group discussions. Although I do take Peter's point that there's a CBD meeting coming up and other things like that. My impression is that, and if you read the report, there are a lot of countries that we spoke to about CBD. It's a case that actually just even trying to meet those basic guidelines for each individual country is so hard that they haven't thought beyond that. So our individual thing on this is, you know, how do you want to conceptualize it as an individual country trying to deal with this? We'd love to, in future work, think about what that means in a multilateral level, but we haven't quite reached at that point. And yes, probably policymakers are the higher order ones here, but we'd love to think if you are conceptualizing a project that's going to be very controversial before you go to approvals, that this would be something you would consider looking at as well. So that's something that I want to add there. So we've got that data sharing sending. Yep. Sorry, and we've got Jose here as well. So future reference, Singapore highlighting differentiated recommended rights responsible for data sending and receiving. I'm just going to say one thing on that as well, because one of the things that we've seen, like when we speak to people that are sharing data who are trying to do it for very positive reasons, one, it's if they try and follow the laws, it's very difficult. Okay, that's fine and to be expected. But we also spoke to a lot of people across the region. I think almost none of them acting with malice, but they would share data with counterparts in other countries, often in ways that might be in contravention of laws. But just so the monitoring of data sharing, it seems to me when you're dealing with the non-human stuff particularly, is actually particularly hard, because we're dealing with just essentially very small bits of information that can be shared extremely easily. And so that's a massive challenge. All right, we've got a lot of questions here. Unfortunately, I can't get to all of them. I see that Shambhuvi's already answered a couple of them. I'm going to run around and say last comments. So I'm going to give Shambhuvi, Saurabh, and Henry just about 30 seconds each for any last comments they want. And then I'm going to let Joy have the floor and finish up the conversation, and we'll finish there. So over to you, Shambhuvi.
Hey, thank you, Dirk. I think thank you all for your comments and suggestions. We've always spoken about this when writing this report, is that this is not the final report, that we keep on making additions, we keep on making iterations, because as we learn from diverse perspectives. So thank you for putting those across. I think my one takeaway from the conversation is that, again, these are prompts for thinking. So do think about it, do come back to us if you have any ways of improving them. If you can suggest how countries can operationalize them, that's going to be the next step that we are looking forward to. And thank you for taking time out to listen to us.
Yeah, so again, I would like to express my sincere thanks to everyone for their comments and feedback. It is, every time we talk about this, it's a new learning experience. As Shambhuvi said, it's like, oh yeah, we should think about that and we should also add that. But at the end, it is like the scope and time is always a factor. But I think one bigger learning from this whole experience is that, yeah, I mean, data sharing itself is quite complicated, and there is not one framework or one rule that can, regulate it all. So like broad principles are something that hopefully the countries together can adopt, which then they can tailor according to their own needs. I think that's one way we can maybe get some broad global agreement on data sharing. That itself is a bit utopian, but let's hope for the best. Thank you.
So yeah, so I guess my comment is the big thing that I take away from this, from the public views and the public engagement side, sort of goes back to my roots of working cross-culturally on views and values and so on. When this did come up in some of our workshops, that there is a need to better clarify and collate views across the Indo-Pacific and have those views on the ground to be able to better scale against it what we've developed in terms of the public framework down there, and perhaps update it. But yeah, there's a lot of novel applications out there. There is a lot of good work that's being done, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done. And finally, particularly in certain contexts, and I just referenced one of them earlier, where we basically have no data at all, and that's something that it needs to be rectified, because otherwise it's just sort of speaking too abstractly and broadly and not testing this particular framework in question. So that's the big thing that I take away from this. And I don't know, hopefully we'll get to do that. But again, as always, all these sorts of things require funding.
Okay, excellent. Over to you, Joy, to take us home.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's been a very illuminating discussion. I just want to go back to the two questions that I provoked at the beginning. What is the report for? And I think all of you have quite rightly spotted one tricky business that the team have to handle over the past year. That is the balance between offering stability or predictability of a framework, but also accommodating flexibility. And of course, this is a classic question for all regulators, and perhaps every report can help us just get that ever closer to optimal balance or adjust that balance. And I guess all the questions you've provoked highlight the point of continuous discussions. That is, we do need that kind of global dialogue. But one thing that occurred to me is that we talk a lot about data sharing. We talk a lot about public engagement. But I think what we're doing here is not just exchanging talks or exchanging views. Hopefully, in the future, when we have another gathering like this, we'll also be able to share good practices and experience and that. And so with that, I invite you to our future discussions whenever and wherever it may be, in person or online. And so thank you, everyone, again.
So thank you very much. And thank you all for joining me. Really, really appreciate it. Have a very good Thursday, whether it's morning, evening, or wherever you are. And I'm sure we'll see you at another time.